Chapter 6 of Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov chanced subsequently to learn why the artisan and the peasant woman had invited Elizaveta to their home. The matter was of the most ordinary kind and involved nothing particularly remarkable. A family from out of town who had landed in poverty was selling some of their belongings, clothes and the like, all of it women's stuff. Since selling things in the market never brought much profit, they were looking for a woman to do the selling for them elsewhere. This was the occupation Elizaveta had found for herself. She took commission, went here and there on business, and did a thriving trade, as she was very honest and always asked the lowest price, whatever price she named. That was the one at which she sold. As a rule, she said little and, as she had already been remarked, was submissive and easily frightened. Recently, however, Raskolnikov had become superstitious. The traces of superstition were to remain in him for a long time afterwards, and he never really got rid of them. Indeed, in this whole affair, he was always subsequently inclined to perceive a certain strangeness and mystery, as if it involved the working of certain peculiar influences and coincidences. Back in the winter, a certain student he knew by the name of Pogarev had at one point during a conversation they had had as the latter was about to depart for Kiev, slipped him Alyona Ivanovna's, the old woman's, address in case he should need to pawn anything. For a long time he had held off from going to see her, as he had had his teaching and was managing to get by somehow. Some 6 weeks ago he had remembered about the address. He had two personal possessions that were suitable for pawning. One was the old silver watch he had inherited from his father, and the other was a small golden ring with 3 red stones of some description, which his sister had given him at their parting as a keepsake. He decided to take the ring, having tracked the old woman down. He felt towards her, at first glance, without as yet knowing anything in particular about her, an unmasterable sense of revulsion. Took 2 tickets from her, and on his way looked in at a certain rather inferior little eating house. He ordered tea, sat down, and began to think very hard. A strange idea had popped up in his head like a chicken broken from an egg, and he was finding it very, very absorbing. Sitting almost side by side with him at another table were a student whom he did not know at all, and whose face he did not remember, and a young officer. They had been playing billiards and were now drinking tea. Suddenly he heard the student telling the officer about the pawnbroker, Alyona Ivanovna, the collegiate secretary's widow, and giving him her address. This alone seemed somehow strange to Raskolnikov. There he was, having just come from there, and now the first people he met were talking about her. It was merely a coincidence, of course, but even so, he was now unable to get rid of a certain very peculiar feeling. And now it was as if someone were doing his best to worm himself into his favor. The student had suddenly begun to tell his companion all sorts of details about this Alyona Ivanovna. She's amazing, he was saying. You can always get money out of her. She's as wealthy as a Jew. She could let you have 5,000 straight off. Yes, she won't turn her nose up even at a ruble pledge. A lot of us have been to see her, only she's a horrible old cow. And he began to relate how mean and capricious she was, how one needed only to be 1 day late in redeeming one's pledge for the thing to be lost. She would give 1/4 of the item's value and take monthly interest of 5 and even 7%, and so on. The student got carried away and informed his companion, moreover, that the old woman had a sister called Lizaveta, whom she, small and repulsive, beat every minute of the day and kept in total bondage, like a little child, while Lizaveta, at least 6 feet tall. I mean, it's a real phenomenon, the student exclaimed and burst into laughter. They began to discuss Lizaveta. The student talked about her with a peculiar satisfaction and kept laughing while the officer listened with great interest and asked the student to send this Lizaveta over to mend some linen for him. Raskolnikov did not miss a single word and learned everything in one go. Lizaveta was the old woman's younger half-sister. They had different mothers, and she was 35 years old. She worked for her sister day and night, performed the functions of cook and washerwoman in the household, and in addition, did sewing, which she sold, and even hired herself out to scrub floors, giving all that she earned to her sister. She did not dare to take a single order to accept, or she did not dare to take a single order or accept a single job of work without the old woman's consent. Another thing was that the old woman had already made her will, a fact that was known to Lizaveta, who did not stand to inherit a single kopeck, just the old woman's personal effects, some chairs, and so forth. All the money had been earmarked for distribution to a certain monastery in the province of N, in return for the eternal remembrance of her soul. Lizaveta had retained her petty bourgeois origins, unlike her sister who had married into the civil service. She had not married and was terribly awkward, of remarkable height, with great, long, almost bandy-looking legs, always with down-at-heel goatskin shoes on her feet, and she paid especial attention to her personal cleanliness. The thing that the student found astonishing and that made him laugh, however, was that Lizaveta was constantly pregnant. But I thought you said she was a freak. Well, she's sort of swarthy, like a soldier dressed up, pretending to be a woman. But she's not at all a freak. She has such a kind face, such kind eyes. Yes, really she has. And the proof of it is that a lot of men find her attractive. Talking about Lizaveta. She's a quiet sort, meek, mild, compliant. She'll go along with anything, and she has a really nice smile. I say, do you find her attractive too? The officer laughed. Oh, only because she's so strange. No, but I'll tell you this. I'd murder that old woman and rob her of all her money, and I swear to you, I'd do it without the slightest twinge of conscience, the student added with heat. The officer burst out laughing again, and Raskolnikov started. How strange this was. If you'll permit me, I'd like to ask you a serious question, the student said, growing excited. I was joking just now, of course, but look, on the one hand, you have a nasty, stupid, worthless, meaningless, sick old woman who's no use to anyone and is indeed actually harmful to people, who doesn't even know herself why she's alive, and who's going to kick the bucket of her own accord tomorrow. Do you get my meaning, do you? Yes, I think I do, the officer replied, fixing his eyes on his excited companion. Listen to this, then. There, on the other hand, you have young, fresh energies that are going to waste for want of backing. Thousands of people are involved, and it's happening everywhere. 100, 1,000 good deeds and undertakings that could be arranged and expedited with that old woman's money, which is doomed to go to a monastery. Hundreds, possibly even thousands of lives that could be set on the right road. Dozens of families saved from poverty, breakup, ruin, depravity, the venereal hospitals, and all of that with her money. If one were to kill her and take her money in order with its help to devote oneself to the service of all mankind and the common cause, what do you think? Wouldn't one petty little crime like that be atoned for by all those thousands of good deeds? Instead of one life, thousands of lives rescued from corruption and decay. One death to 100 lives. I mean, there's arithmetic for you. And anyway, what does the life of that horrible, stupid, consumptive old woman count for when weighed in the common balance? No more than the life of a louse, a cockroach. And it's not even worth that, because the old woman is harmful. She's wearing another person's life out. She's mean. She bit Lizaveta's finger out of meanness the other day. She very nearly severed it. Of course she doesn't deserve to live, the officer observed. But then that's nature. But it's possible to correct and channel nature, old man. Otherwise we would all just drown in a sea of prejudice. If it weren't for that, there would never have been a single great man. People say duty, conscience. Well, I won't say a word against duty and conscience, but after all, what do we mean by them? Wait, I want to ask you another question. Listen. No, I want to ask you a question first. You listen. Well, here you are talking and holding forth in that oratorical way of yours, but tell me, are you going to kill the old woman? Of course not. I merely thought it would be her just... Okay, of course not. I merely thought it would be her just desserts. It's no business of mine. Well, the way I see it is that there are no just desserts in it at all unless you're prepared to do it yourself. Let's go and have another game. Raskolnikov was in a state of extreme excitement. All this was, of course, the most commonplace and the most frequently encountered kind of conversation. Many times before he had heard the same ideas expressed by young people in other forms and in relation to other subjects. But why had he chanced to hit upon such talk and such ideas precisely now, when inside his own head there had just been engendered precisely those very same thoughts? And why precisely now, when he had only just come away from the old woman with the embryo of his idea? Should he immediately have happened upon a conversation about her? This coincidence always seemed to him a strange one. This trivial eating-house conversation had an extremely strong influence on him during the subsequent development of the affair, as though here some form of predestination, of augury, had been at work. That's kind of like the officer will just blame it on that guy. He just has to tell one person that he mentioned it, and they'll think it was him. Returning from the Haymarket, he threw himself on the sofa and sat there for a while. Okay. Reading a lot. My brain ain't working with my mouth. So returning from the Haymarket, he threw himself on the sofa and sat there for a whole hour with no movement. Meanwhile, it grew dark. He had no candle, and indeed the notion of lighting one never entered his head. Later, he could never remember whether he had been thinking about anything during that time. At last, he felt a return of his earlier fever and shivering, and realized with pleasure that it was possible to lie down on the sofa, too. Before long, a sound, leaden sleep, descended on him, seeming to press him down. He slept for an unusually long time and had no dreams. Nastasia, when she came into his room at 10 o'clock the next morning, was hardly able to rouse him. She had brought him tea and bread. The tea was again weak stuff made with used leaves and was again served in her own teapot. Ugh, the way he sleeps, she exclaimed indignantly. He does nothing but sleep, either. With an effort, he raised himself. His head was aching. He got to his feet, turned around once in his room, and fell back on the sofa again. Sleeping again? Nastasia exclaimed. Are you ill or what? He made no reply. Do you want tea? Later, he said with an effort, closing his eyes again and turning his face to the wall. Nastasia went on standing over him for a bit. Maybe he really is ill, she said, turned away and went out of the room. She came back again at 2 o'clock with some soup. He was lying as he had been earlier. The tea stood untouched. Nastasia actually took offense and began to push him and shove him with spite. What are you snoozing away there for? She exclaimed, looking at him with revulsion. He raised himself on one elbow and sat up, but said nothing to her and merely looked at the floor. Are you ill or aren't you? Nastasia asked, but again she received no reply. You want to get out for a bit? She said after a pause. It would do you good to get some fresh air. Are you going to have this food or what? She looks out for him. Later he said weakly, go away, and he made a motion with his hand. She stood there a bit longer, looked at him compassionately, and then went out. A few moments later he raised his eyes and gave the tea and the soup a long stare. Then he took the bread and the spoon and began to eat. He hardly touched the food, had no appetite, took only 3 or 4 spoonfuls in an absent-minded sort of way. His head was aching less now. Having had all he wanted, he stretched out on the sofa again, but was unable to get back to sleep, and lay there without moving, on his front, with his face thrust into the pillow. He kept having waking fantasies, and they were all such strange ones. Most frequently of all, he fancied he was somewhere in Africa in some kind of Egyptian oasis. A caravan was resting. The camels were lying down peacefully. All around there were palm trees, an entire circle of them. Everyone was eating their evening meal. He, however, kept drinking water straight from the spring that flowed murmuring right by his side. It was so cool, and the water was so wonderfully cold and blue, hurrying over various colored stones and sand that was so pure, with spangles of gold. Suddenly he distinctly heard the sound of a clock strike, and he started snapping out of his trance, raised his head, looked out of the window, figured what time it was, and suddenly leaped up. In full possession of his senses now, as though someone had hauled him off the sofa. He went over to the door on tiptoe, softly opened it a little way, and began to listen on the stairs. His heart was beating terribly, but on the staircase all was quiet, as if everyone were asleep. It seemed wild and improbable to him that he could have spent since yesterday in such oblivion, without yet having done anything or made any preparations. And that might have been 6 o'clock striking just now. Suddenly an extraordinary feverish and somehow helpless turmoil seized hold of him, in place of his slumber and torpor. There were, in fact, few preparations to be made. He strained all his energies in order to think of everything and leave nothing out, but his heart kept beating and beating, thumping so badly that he began to find it difficult to breathe. The first thing he had to do was make a loop and sew it to his coat, the work of a moment. He felt under his pillow and retrieved from the pile of linen he had stuffed underneath it one of his shirts, which was practically falling apart. Old and unwashed, from its rags he tore off a ribbon-like strip about 2 inches wide and 16 inches long. He folded his strip in two, took off his wide, tough fabric summer coat, the only outdoor garment he possessed, and began to sew both ends of the strip to the inside of his left armpit. His hand shook as he sewed, but he managed to do it, and in such a way that from the outside nothing was visible when he put the coat back on. The needle and the thread he had procured long ago, and he kept them at his bedside table, wrapped up in a piece of paper. As for the loop, this was a very ingenious device of his own design. The loop was intended to hold an axe. It was out of the question to go around in the streets with an axe in one's hand. Even if one were to hide it under one's coat, one would still have to keep it in place with one's arm, which would be noticeable. Now with the loop, however, all he had to do was put the head of the axe through it, and it would hang conveniently under his arm on the inside of the coat, all the way there. And by putting his hand in one of the side pockets, he could hold on the handle of the axe to stop it from dangling about. And since, too, the coat was a very roomy one, a veritable sack, no one would be able to see from the outside that he was holding onto something through the lining of his pocket. This loop was also something he had devised earlier, some 2 weeks previously. Having finished with this, he thrust his fingers into the narrow slit between his Turkish sofa and the floor, felt about in the left-hand corner, and pulled out the pledge he had manufactured and hidden there a long time ago. This pledge was in fact not really a pledge at all, just a smoothly plain piece of wood no larger or thicker than the average silver cigarette case. He had found this piece of wood on one of his walks in a certain courtyard, one wing of which housed some workshop or other. Later he had added a thin, smooth iron plate. He had probably broken off something else, which he had also found in the street that same day. Fitting the two objects together, the iron one was smaller than the wooden one. He bound them firmly to each other, crosswise, by means of a length of thread. Then he wrapped them neatly and presentably in a sheet of clean white paper, and tied the parcel with a slender ribbon, also crosswise, adjusting the knot in such a manner that it would be rather difficult to undo. This was so that the old woman's attention would be distracted for a time. While she was fiddling with the knot, he would seize the moment. He had added the iron plate for the sake of extra weight, so that the old woman would not at once guess that the item was made of wood. All this he had been keeping under his sofa until the time came. No sooner had he retrieved the thing than he suddenly heard a shout down in the yard somewhere. Here he heard a noise. It struck 6 long ago, oh my God. He rushed to the door, listened, snatched up his hat, and began to descend his 13 steps cautiously and audibly like a cat. A most important part of the business still lay ahead. He had still an axe from the kitchen. That the deed had to be done with an axe was something he had decided long ago. He also had a folding garden knife, but he had no confidence in the knife, and still less in his own strength. That was why he had finally decided that he must use an axe. It may, incidentally, be worth noting here one peculiar feature of all the final decisions he had so far taken in this affair. They all had one strange characteristic. The more final they had grown, the more monstrous and absurd they at once became to his eyes. In spite of the entire agonizing inner struggle he went through, never for one instant was he able to believe in the feasibility of his intentions, or in the feasibility of his intentions during that whole time. And even if it were somehow to come to pass that he managed to work everything out, make all his decisions watertight, down to the last detail, leaving no room for a single doubt, even then he would have turned his back on the whole thing as on something absurd, outrageous, and impossible. There remained, however, a whole host of unresolved points and questions that still had to be dealt with. As for how he was to get hold of an axe, that trivial question did not trouble him in the slightest, because there was nothing easier. The fact was that Nastasia was hardly ever at home, and this was especially true in the evening. She was either going out to see the neighbors or running down to the corner shop, and she always left the door wide open. That was the very thing the landlady kept having those quarrels with her about. So all he had to do when the time came was to go quietly into the kitchen and take the axe, and then an hour later, when it was all over, come in once more and put it back. There were, however, certain imponderables. Supposing he were to return an hour later in order to put the axe back, only to find that Nastasia too had returned, then of course he would have to go past and wait until she had gone out again. But what if she were to notice that the axe had gone and begin to look for it, raise a hue and cry? Then there would be suspicion, or at least grounds for suspicion. But these were merely trivial considerations to which he did not even begin to give any thought, and indeed he had not the time to do so. He was thinking about what was most important. The detail could wait until he was satisfied with everything. This latter condition really did seem unrealizable, however. At least that was how it appeared to him. There was no way, for example, that he could ever imagine bringing his ratiocinations, ratiocinations to an end, getting up and simply going there. Even his recent rehearsal, the visit he had made with the intention of making a final survey of the place, had only been an attempt at a rehearsal, not a real one, much as if he had said, "Come on, much as if he had said, "Come on, I'll go and test it out. What's the point of lying here dreaming?" And had at once been unable to go through with it, had shrugged his shoulders and run away in bitter rage at himself. Yet at the same time, he had the feeling that so far as the moral aspects of the question were concerned, his analysis was now complete. His casuistry, Casuistry, his casuistry had been whetted sharp as a razor, and he was unable to find any more conscious objections within himself. In the last resort, however, he simply had no faith in himself and obstinately, slavishly sought objections right, left, and center, fumbling around for them as though someone were compelling him and drawing him to it. But now this latest day, which had dawned so unexpectedly and had decided everything, acted on him in an almost entirely mechanical fashion, as though someone had taken him by the hand and pulled him along behind him, inexorably, blindly, with unnatural force, countenancing no objections, as though a corner of his clothing had got caught in the flywheel of a machine and he was beginning to draw into it. At first, this had actually been a long time earlier. A certain question had preoccupied him. Why were nearly all crimes so easily tracked down and found out, and why did the traces of nearly all criminals show up so clearly? Little by little, he had arrived at certain diverse and interesting conclusions, and in his opinion, the principal cause was to be found less in the criminal's lack of ability to conceal the material evidence of his crime than it was in the criminal himself. It was the criminal himself who, in almost every case, became subject at the moment of his crime to a kind of failure of will and reason, which were replaced by a childish, phenomenal frivolity. And this right at the very moment when the things that were needed most of all were reason and caution. According to the way he saw it, this eclipse of reason and failure of will attacked human beings like an illness, developing slowly and reaching their crisis not long before the enactment of the crime. They continued to manifest themselves in the same critical fashion at the moment of the crime itself, and also for a short time thereafter. Depending on the individual, then they passed in the same way that every illness passes. On the other hand, the question of whatever it was an illness that gave rise to the crime, or whether the crime itself was by its own peculiar nature invariably accompanied by something resembling an illness, was one that he did not yet feel able to determine. Arriving at such conclusions, he decided that where he personally was concerned in his own undertaking, there could be no such morbid upheavals, and that his reason and his will would remain inalienably with him throughout the entire enactment of what he had planned, for the sole reason that what he had planned was not a crime. We shall omit the lengthy process by which he had arrived at this last conclusion. We have run too far ahead even as it is. We shall merely add that in general, the factual, purely material difficulties of the undertaking played a decidedly secondary role within his mind. As long as I can manage to preserve my will and my reason and exercise them over them to the fullest extent, then they in their turn will all be vanquished when it becomes necessary for them to acquaint themselves with every last microscopic detail of the affair. But the affair was not making any progress. He continued to have not the slightest faith in his final decisions, and when the fatal hour struck, everything turned out not that way at all, but somehow, unexpectedly, even one might almost say astonishingly. A circumstance of the most trivial kind landed him in an impasse, even before he had got to the bottom of the stairs. As he drew level with his landlady's kitchen, the door to which was always stood wide open, he directed a cautious, disapproving look inside in order to find out in advance whether Nastasia, being absent, the landlady was there, or if she was not, whether the door to her room was properly shut. He did not want her peeping out of there when he went in for the axe. Great, however, was his amazement when he suddenly saw that not only was Nastasia at home and in her kitchen, but she was actually doing some work. She was taking the laundry out of its basket and hanging it on the clothesline. At the sight of him, she stopped what she was doing, turned towards him, and continued to stare at him steadily all the time he was passing. He averted his eyes and continued his descent as though he had not noticed anything, but the whole affair was at an end. He had no axe. He was horribly shaken. Now, where did I get the idea, he thought as he was going through the entranceway? Where did I get the idea that she'd be bound to be out just then? Why was I so certain of it? Why? He felt crushed, even in some way humiliated. He wanted to jeer at himself with malicious spite. A slow-witted animal rage seethed up inside him. He paused in the entranceway in order to reflect. To go out on the street like this for show, as if he were taking a walk, was a prospect he found repugnant. The thought of going back to his room was one still more repugnant. What a chance I've lost forever, he muttered as he stood, shorn of purpose, in the entranceway right opposite the yard-keeper's dark little cubicle, the door to which also stood open. Suddenly he gave a start. From the little room, which was only 2 yards away from him, his eyes had caught the glint of something underneath the bench on the right. He looked around him, no one. On tiptoe he approached the yard-keeper's room, went down the 2 little steps, and called the yard-keeper in a faint voice. As I thought, he's not at home, but he must be somewhere nearby in the yard because the door is wide open. He pounced headlong on the axe. It was an axe, dragging it out from under the bench where it lay in between 2 logs. And right there and then, while he was still inside, fastened it to his loop, stuck both hands in his pockets, and stepped out of the cubicle again. No one had noticed anything. If reason won't, the devil will, he thought, smiling a strange, ironic smile. The stroke of fortune had thoroughly revived his spirits. He continued on his way quietly and sedately, without hurry, in order not to give rise to any suspicion. He paid little attention to the passersby, making a great effort not to look them in the face at all, to be as inconspicuous as possible. Then he remembered he was wearing his hat. For God's sake, I even had some money the day before yesterday, yet I didn't go and buy a cap instead. A curse erupted from his soul. Glancing casually out of one eye into a little shop, he saw that the clock on the wall inside said 7:10. He would have to hurry and at the same time make a detour, approach the house by a roundabout route from the other side. Previously, whenever he had occasion to picture all this to himself in his imagination, he had sometimes thought that he would be very afraid. But he was not particularly afraid now. Indeed, he was not afraid at all. At the present moment, he was actually preoccupied by some totally irrelevant thoughts, though they did not last for long. On his way past Yusupov Park, he even began to be thoroughly taken up with an imaginary project of his own devising, the construction of tall fountains, and the way in which they were and the way in which they would properly refresh the air on all the city squares. Little by little, he moved on to the conviction that if the summer garden were to be extended the entire length of the field of Mars and even possibly connecting with the gardens of the Mikhailovsky Palace, this would be an attractive improvement that would also be of benefit to the city. At this point, he suddenly began to develop an interest in the question of why it was that in all the great cities, people seemed to be especially inclined to live and settle in precisely those parts of town where there were no gardens or fountains, where there were dirt and foul smells and all kinds of filth, and that this was not really caused by material necessity. Here he recalled his own walks in the Haymarket, and for a moment he snapped out of his trance. What a load of nonsense, he thought. God, I do better not to think at all. I suppose this must be how men who are being led to the scaffold cling with their thoughts to all the things they meet along the way. This notion flashed across his mind, but it was only a flash. Like lightning, he suppressed it as quickly as possible. But now he was close. Here was the house. Here were the gates. Somewhere a clock beat a single chime. What? Is it really 7:30? That's impossible. It must be fast. To his good fortune, everything went without incident at the gates again. Not only that, but at that very moment, as if by design, a cart carrying an enormous load of hay was in the process of entering the gate in front of him, completely shielding him from view during the whole time he was walking through the entranceway. The instant the cart had succeeded in maneuvering through the gate into the yard, he slipped through to the right. Over there on the other side of the hay cart, several voices could be heard shouting and talking, but no one observed him, and he encountered no one either. Many of the windows that looked on to this enormous quadrangular courtyard were open at that moment, but he did not raise his head. He had not the strength. The staircase that led up to the old woman's apartment was close by, just inside the gate. To the right, he was already on the stairs. Pausing for breath and pressing one hand against his thumping heart, then feeling about for the axe and setting it straight again, he began carefully and quietly to ascend the staircase, straining his ears every moment. But at that particular time, the staircase was quite deserted. All the doors were shut. No one was about. True, the door to one empty apartment on the second floor was wide open, and some decorators were at work inside, painting, but they paid him no attention. He stood still for a moment, thought, and then continued his descent. Of course, it would have been better if there be nobody here at all, but there are 2 more floors above them. Now here was the 4th floor. Here was the door. Okay. Now here was the 4th floor. Here was the door. And there was the apartment opposite, the empty one. To judge by all the signs, the apartment on the 3rd floor, the one right underneath the old woman's, was also empty. The visiting card that had been fixed to the door with nails had been taken down. The other people had moved out. He was panting. For a single instant, there passed through his head the thought, shouldn't I just go away? But he left his own question unanswered and began listening at the old woman's door. Dead silence. Then he listened on the stairs again, listened long and carefully. After that, he looked round one last time, pulled himself together, straightened himself up again, and tested the axe in its loop. Don't I look terribly pale, he thought. Don't I look awfully agitated? She's suspicious. Shouldn't I wait a bit more until my heart has quieted down? But his heart did not quiet down. Quieten down. On the contrary, as if by design, it proceeded to beat harder and harder and harder. He could not endure it. Slowly he stretched out his hand to the bell and rang it. Half a minute later, he rang it again, slightly louder this time. No reply. It was pointless to go on ringing to no purpose. And besides, it might attract attention. The old woman was at home, of course, but she was suspicious and alone. He knew something of her habits, and again he put his ear firmly to the door. Whether it was that his senses were extraordinarily keen, which on the whole was unlikely, or whether each sound really was very audible, he suddenly thought he could make out the cautious whisper of a hand on the latch and the rustle of a dress immediately on the other side of the door. He suddenly thought he could make out the cautious whisper of a hand on the latch and the rustle of a dress immediately on the other side of the door. Someone was standing imperceptibly right by the lock and listening. Just as he was out here, keeping quiet inside and apparently also putting an ear to the door. He purposely made a movement and muttered something in rather a loud voice so as not to make it seem that he was acting furtively. Then he rang a third time, but quietly, sedately, and without any hint of impatience. When he remembered it later in clear and vivid detail, this moment was chiseled within him forever. He could not think where he had got so much cunning from. All the more so as his mind had been subject to momentary blackouts, and he had hardly been conscious of his body at all. A moment later, the sound of someone undoing the bolt was heard. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it, Raskolnikov. Don't do it. Anyway, that's the end of chapter 6. Peace.